Hello folks, this is going to be a lecture on concurrency. So for a particular region, the unreserved concurrency for your lambda function is 1000. So what that means is if you take a particular slice of time, then for that particular slice of time, not more than 1000 lambdas can run or execute. You can also provision concurrency for a particular function if you wish. That particular function can have a maximum concurrency of 900 and not more than that, because there is a limit of having at least 100 unreserved concurrency for your lambdas. So if you have a reserved concurrency for a function, what that means is that it cannot execute for more than that particular number. And the other thing to understand is that that particular function will have that particular number reserved for it. So the other lambdas which are unreserved cannot bite into that particular number. So that's one more thing you need to understand for unreserved concurrency. Also, you can have the option of throttling that function altogether just by setting the concurrency to 0. There is a concept of provision concurrency. To understand provision concurrency, you need to understand the life cycle of a lambda function. There is initially the init function. So in the init function, the lambdas would unfreeze and create an executable environment. So in this particular init, it would download the code, it would initialize the runtime, and it would run the initialization code. So the initialization code is all the code that runs outside the handler function. So this actually refers to what is known as cold start. This is the time that it takes for the environment to be up. So when you have provision concurrency, what that means is that this particular init function is already set up for you. So there is always a background lambda that is always running, and that would pick up your piece of code and invoke it directly. So the invoke is the second part of your life cycle. So this is the part where your lambdas executes the handler function, and this is the part where your function actually runs. And the third part is the shutdown. So the shutdown happens after the invoke has taken place. The shutdown doesn't happen immediately after the invoke. It waits for some time and sees if there are other new requests that have come in. If they haven't, then the shutdown process happens. So in the shutdown process, the whole environment is completely shut down. So let's look at it in a more diagrammatic manner. So let's assume that there are two requests, request 1 and request 2. And let's assume that y-axis is time passed or time elapsed. So you have request 1 and request 2. So initially the init would take place if you have not provisioned your concurrency. So after the init has taken place, your invoke commands will take place. This is the invoke that would execute the code in your particular lambda. So let's assume that after the invoke has taken place, there are 3 new requests that have come in. So once these 3 new requests come in, so after these 3 new requests come in, the first 2 processes would take care of request 3 and request 4, and for request number 5 there would be another environment set up. So at this moment of time, even though there have been 5 requests that have executed, the concurrency would remain 3, because for the request number 3 and 4, it would reuse the environment that was set up by request 1 and request 2. So this is how concurrency actually works. And once request 3 and request 4 have completed, then it would shut down the environment. And similarly, request 5 would get executed, and then that too would shut down. So this is a broad way in which you can see how the concurrency actually is set up in Lambda. So let's have a look at the demo. So here I have my hello world function. The first thing I will do is I will throttle this function. So if I click on this throttle button, what happens is that this particular function becomes a reserved concurrency with the value set as 0. So if I click this and if I click on confirm, you can see that if I click on test and if I try to run this, it fails because it is basically throttled to not run at all. So if I go down to the concurrency, you can see that the reserved concurrency is currently set to 0. So I can go ahead and edit this. So I can edit this to a number that is less than 900. So if I set it to more than 900, it will fail. So that is how you can reserve your concurrency for a particular function. So if I click on save with 10, that means that this particular lambda can run concurrently 10 times and not more than that. If I click on test again, you can see that the throttle is again disabled, and if I click on test again, it should work. So once I have run my particular lambda, you can go ahead and see the logs. There is something called as the init duration. So this is the time it took for the particular lambda to initialize. So this particular value can vary based on the number of libraries that you have installed and the static code that would run outside the handler. So if I were to click on test again, this particular init duration would disappear because there is already an environment that is pre-warmed and available. So if I click on this test again, you can see that the init duration completely disappears. So this is how you know that this particular environment, or should I say, when I clicked on test again, it ran without the cold start. So that is how you would figure out whether your lambda has run with the cold start or without the cold start. And the other thing is that the build duration is always based on the invoke time and not based on the cold start time. The other thing I would like to show you briefly is the provision concurrency. So if I click on add, I can add provision concurrency to either an alias or a version. So I can't add a provision concurrency to an unpublished latest version of the Lambda. So that is one thing you need to understand. So let's assume that I have an alias created. So I can click on this alias and I can only choose a number either equal to or less than 10 based on the number of reserved concurrency I have. So if I were to choose 10, you can see the cost that it would incur if I were to have all the 10 set to provision concurrency. So for provision concurrency, I will have a separate video because that's actually a larger topic to discuss. So for the time being, you can just understand that provision concurrency can only be set on either an alias or a version and not on a undeployed version of the code or the $latest version of the code. And the number of provision concurrency can either be equal to or less than the reserved concurrency that you have set. So that's it for the time being. For provision concurrency, I will hopefully have a video coming up soon. Thank you.